France in 1788 was the envy of Europe and simultaneously on the brink of collapse. The kingdom that had produced Versailles, that had dominated European politics for over a century, that held a population of 28 million souls, more than any other European state, was dying from within. The magnificent facade of royal power concealed a rotting foundation of debt, inequality, and hunger that would soon explode into the most consequential revolution in human history. Picture the scene. In the streets of Paris, bread prices had doubled. Peasants in the countryside, who comprised 80% of France's population, were crushed under feudal dues, church tithes, and royal taxes that consumed more than half their income. Meanwhile, in the glittering halls of Versailles, King Louis XV and his court continued their lavish lifestyle, seemingly oblivious to the mounting crisis. The French treasury was bankrupt, drained by costly wars, including support for the American Revolution, an ironic contribution to a rebellion that would soon inspire France's own. But this wasn't merely an economic crisis. Something had shifted in the minds of Frenchmen. The ideas of Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu had permeated educated society. They spoke of natural rights, popular sovereignty, and the social contract. They questioned the divine right of kings. They imagined a world where merit mattered more than birth, where reason trumped tradition, where citizens held power instead of subjects obeying masters. These ideas, once confined to salons and books, were becoming dangerous. The aristocracy sensed the coming storm, but misunderstood its magnitude. They saw the crisis as an opportunity to reclaim powers lost to the crown over centuries of royal centralization. The king's ministers understood that France needed fundamental reform, new taxes on the privileged classes, a rationalized administration. But every reform attempt crashed against the rocks of aristocratic resistance. The nobles who dominated the Parlement, the high courts of France, refused to register new tax laws. They demanded that only an Estates General, a medieval assembly not convened since 1614, could approve such measures. King Louis XVI, a well-meaning but indecisive man, more interested in locksmithing than governance, found himself trapped. He needed money to avoid bankruptcy. He needed the nobility's cooperation to get that money. But the nobility wanted political concessions he was unwilling to grant. In a fateful decision that would unleash forces beyond anyone's control, Louis agreed to summon the Estates General for May 1789. He hoped it would solve his financial problems. Instead, it would destroy his kingdom. As winter turned to spring in 1789, all of France buzzed with political excitement. Elections were held for deputies to represent the three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and everyone else, the third estate. Across the kingdom, communities drafted cahiers de doléances, lists of grievances to present to the king. These documents revealed a nation united in demanding change, but divided on everything else. Some cahiers called for moderate reforms within the existing system. Others demanded the abolition of feudalism itself. What united them was a conviction that the old order could not continue. The Third Estates. Deputies arrived at Versailles, representing over 96% of France's population, but expecting to be outvoted by the other two estates. Among them were lawyers, merchants, and minor officials. Educated men influenced by Enlightenment thought. Ambitious and frustrated by a system that reserved the highest positions for aristocrats regardless of ability. They came prepared not merely to petition, but to demand. They would not leave without fundamentally changing France. None of them could have imagined where this would lead. Within 4 years, the king they still professed loyalty to in 1789 would be dead, his head severed by a revolutionary machine called the guillotine. Within 5 years, France would be consuming its own revolutionary leaders in an orgy of political violence that would claim tens of thousands of lives. Within 10 years, the revolution born in the name of liberty would culminate in military dictatorship under a Corsican general named Napoleon Bonaparte, who would crown himself emperor and plunge Europe into decades of war. The French Revolution would become the founding event of modern politics, giving birth to nationalism, left and right political ideologies, the metric system, the concept of total war, and the idea that ordinary people could reshape their government through revolutionary action. Its echoes would resound through every subsequent revolution, from Russia to China to the Arab Spring. The question, what went wrong, would haunt political thinkers for centuries. This is the story of how it happened, how a financial crisis became a political revolution, how idealism transformed into terror, how the pursuit of liberty ended in dictatorship, how 10 years changed the world forever. This is the French Revolution, from Bastille to Bonaparte. When the Estates General convened at Versailles on May 5, 1789, the stage was set for confrontation. The deputies gathered in a grand hall, separated by estate as tradition demanded. The clergy in their ecclesiastical robes, the nobility in silk and swords, and the Third Estate in plain black, a symbolic representation of the social hierarchy the revolution would soon demolish. King Louis XVI addressed them, speaking primarily about finances and taxes, offering no vision for fundamental reform. The Third Estate's deputies listened with growing frustration. They had not come to tinker with the tax code. They had come to remake France. The first battle was procedural, but procedure mattered immensely. Would the estates vote by order, each estate casting one collective vote, meaning the clergy and nobility could always outvote the Third Estate 2-1, or would they vote by head, with each deputy's vote counting equally, giving the Third Estate numerical superiority? The king and the privileged orders favored voting by estate. The Third Estate demanded voting by head. For 6 weeks, the Estates General accomplished nothing as this deadlock persisted. On June 17, 1789, the Third Estate made a revolutionary move. Led by the Abbé Sieyès, who had written a famous pamphlet titled "What is the Third Estate?", arguing that commoners were the true nation of France, the deputies declared themselves the National Assembly, the legitimate representative body of the French people. They invited the other estates to join them, but made clear they would proceed with or without aristocratic and clerical participation. This was revolution by declaration. The Third Estate had unilaterally claimed sovereignty for itself. King Louis responded with typical indecision. He closed the hall where the National Assembly had been meeting, ostensibly for renovations, but clearly intending to intimidate the rebels. This clumsy move backfired spectacularly. On June 20th, the deputies found their meeting hall locked and guarded. Outraged but undeterred, they relocated to a nearby indoor tennis court. There, in a moment that would become legendary, they took the tennis court oath, swearing never to disband until France had a written constitution. Rain poured on the tennis court's windows, as over 600 men pledged to transform France from an absolute monarchy into a constitutional state. The revolution had crossed a point of no return. Louis attempted to reassert control through a royal session on June 23rd, offering modest reforms while commanding the estates to meet separately and declaring the National Assembly's previous decisions null and void. After the king departed, his master of ceremonies ordered the deputies to leave. The Comte de Mirabeau, a nobleman who had sided with the Third Estate, delivered a defiant response that captured the revolutionary moment. "Go tell your master that we are here by the will of the people, and we will not leave except at the point of bayonets." The king, lacking resolve for violence, backed down. Within days, liberal nobles and clergy began joining the National Assembly. By early July, even Louis reluctantly acknowledged the Assembly's existence. But the revolution's epicenter was shifting from Versailles to Paris. The capital was gripped by economic crisis and political excitement. Bread prices remained catastrophically high. Unemployment was rampant. Rumors spread that the king was gathering troops to dissolve the assembly by force, and that aristocrats were hoarding grain to starve the people into submission. These rumors, whether true or false, created an atmosphere of paranoia and rage. Paris was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. That spark came on July 11th, when Louis dismissed Jacques Necker, his popular finance minister. Parisians interpreted this as confirmation that the king intended to crush the assembly and restore absolute power. The city exploded. Crowds surged through the streets, arming themselves by raiding gunsmiths' shops and the royal armory at Les Invalides, where they seized thousands of muskets. But they needed gunpowder and ammunition, which were stored in the Bastille, a medieval fortress prison in eastern Paris that symbolized royal authority and arbitrary justice. On the morning of July 14, 1789, a crowd of approximately 1,000 Parisians, artisans, shopkeepers, workers approached the Bastille demanding the weapons stored inside. The fortress governor, Bernard-René de Launay, tried to negotiate, but talks broke down. What happened next remains somewhat confused in historical accounts, but gunfire erupted. The crowd, now enraged, assaulted the fortress. After hours of fighting that left nearly 100 attackers dead, garrison soldiers mutinied and opened the gates. The crowd surged in, seized the ammunition, and captured Governor de Launay. Despite promises of safe conduct, the mob murdered him, cut off his head, and paraded it through Paris on a pike. The storming of the Bastille was militarily insignificant. The fortress held only 7 prisoners, none of them political martyrs, but symbolically, it was everything. The people of Paris had defied and defeated royal authority. When Louis XVI was informed of the Bastille's fall, legend says he asked, "Is it a revolt?" His aide replied, "No, sire, it is a revolution." The king had no reliable troops in Paris and no stomach for civil war. He traveled to Paris on July 17th, where he accepted a tricolour cockade, blue and red for Paris, white for the king, symbolizing the merger of royal and popular sovereignty. July 14th would become France's national day, the birthday of revolutionary liberty. The revolution spread beyond Paris like wildfire. In the countryside, peasants rose against their feudal lords in what became known as the Great Fear. Rumors of aristocratic conspiracies and brigand armies sent panic through rural France. Peasants armed themselves, attacked chateaux, and burned the feudal documents that recorded their obligations to nobles. The National Assembly, confronted with nationwide peasant insurrection, made another revolutionary decision. On the night of August 4th, 1789, in a scene of remarkable political theatre, noble deputies voluntarily renounced their feudal privileges. One after another, they stood to surrender hunting rights, tax exemptions, seigneurial dues, and special jurisdictions. By dawn, 1,000 years of feudalism had been legally abolished in France. 3 weeks later, on August 26th, the Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, one of history's foundational documents. Influenced by Enlightenment philosophy and the American Declaration of Independence, it proclaimed that men are born and remain free and equal in rights, that sovereignty resides in the nation rather than the king, and that these rights include liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It guaranteed freedom of speech, press, and religion. It declared that law must be the same for all, and that only the people's representatives could levy taxes. These 17 articles would inspire liberation movements worldwide for the next 2 centuries. But revolutionary principles were easier to declare than implement. The Assembly struggled to create a new constitution while managing France's collapsed finances and maintaining order. King Louis XVI, who still possessed executive power, refused to approve both the August 4th decrees abolishing feudalism and the Declaration of Rights. This royal obstinacy, combined with continued food shortages, provoked another popular intervention. On October 5th, 1789, thousands of Parisian women, market women, working women, shopkeepers' wives, marched the 12 miles from Paris to Versailles in pouring rain. They were furious about bread prices and demanded that the king return to Paris, where the people could watch him. The National Guard, a citizen militia commanded by the Marquis de Lafayette, a liberal noble who had fought in the American Revolution, followed to maintain order. The crowd occupied the National Assembly and surrounded the palace. The next morning, some protesters broke into the palace through an unlocked gate searching for the Queen. Marie Antoinette, widely hated as a spendthrift Austrian foreigner, barely escaped. The mob killed 2 royal bodyguards and would have killed the Queen if not for the intervention of Lafayette's guardsmen. Under immense pressure and thinly veiled threats, the king agreed to return to Paris. The royal family was escorted back to the capital, surrounded by thousands of armed citizens, with the heads of the murdered bodyguards carried on pikes. As one observer noted, they were bringing the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's little boy to Paris, as if the king's presence would somehow produce bread. The October days marked another turning point. The king was now effectively a prisoner in Paris, residing in the Tuileries Palace under popular surveillance. The National Assembly also relocated to Paris, bringing the revolution's political center into direct contact with the capital's volatile population. Versailles, symbol of absolute monarchy, was abandoned. For nearly 2 years, from late 1789 through 1791, France experimented with constitutional monarchy. The National Assembly worked to rationalize and modernize French institutions. They abolished the old provinces and divided France into 83 departments of roughly equal size, making administration more uniform. They introduced the metric system. They nationalized church lands to pay government debts, then issued paper currency called assignats backed by this land. They passed the civil constitution of the clergy, which reorganized the Catholic Church as a department of state, requiring priests to swear loyalty to the new regime, a decision that would alienate millions of devout Catholics and create lasting divisions in French society. The Assembly also debated who would have political rights in the new France. Would all men be citizens with equal voting rights, or would citizenship be restricted based on property qualifications? The Assembly chose a compromise that satisfied no one. They divided men into active citizens who paid sufficient taxes to vote, and passive citizens who possessed rights but not political participation. Women were excluded entirely, despite the prominent role they had played in revolutionary events. This contradiction between universal rights rhetoric and limited political practice would fuel future radical movements. King Louis XVI went through the motions of accepting the new order, but privately he despised the revolution. He saw the civil constitution of the clergy as sacrilege and his own reduced status as humiliation. On June 20th, 1791, the royal family attempted to flee France in disguise, hoping to reach royalist armies on the frontier and return at the head of a foreign invasion to restore absolute monarchy. This escape attempt, known as the Flight to Varennes, failed spectacularly when the king was recognized in the small town of Varennes and arrested. He was brought back to Paris in disgrace. The Flight to Varennes destroyed any remaining trust between king and revolution. How could France maintain constitutional monarchy with a king who openly sought its destruction? The Assembly, dominated by moderates desperate to avoid further radicalization, invented the fiction that the king had been kidnapped and suspended him temporarily. But radical clubs, especially the Jacobins and the popular societies, demanded stronger action. On July 17, 1791, a crowd gathered on the Champ de Mars to sign a petition demanding the king's deposition. The National Guard, under Lafayette's command, fired on the crowd, killing dozens. The massacre on the Champ de Mars revealed the growing gulf between the Assembly's constitutional moderates and Paris's democratic radicals. Despite this tension, the Assembly completed the Constitution of 1791, establishing France as a constitutional monarchy with a unicameral legislature elected by active citizens. The king retained executive power, including a suspensive veto over legislation. In September 1791, Louis XVI swore to uphold this constitution, and the National Assembly dissolved itself, replaced by a new legislative assembly elected under the new rules. The revolution seemed to have achieved its goals. Absolutism was dead. France had a constitution. Feudalism was abolished, and the nation was governed by its propertied citizens. Many revolutionaries believed the revolution was complete. They were catastrophically wrong. The most radical and violent phases of the revolution still lay ahead. Within a year, France would be a republic at war with most of Europe. Within 2 years, the guillotine would be working overtime in the Place de la Révolution, and revolutionary leaders would be devouring each other in political purges that turned Paris into a city of fear. The question was not whether the revolution was finished, but how much further into extremism it would plunge before exhausting itself. The Legislative Assembly that convened in October 1791 was doomed from the start by a well-intentioned but foolish decision. The outgoing National Assembly had decreed that none of its members could serve in the new legislature, supposedly to ensure a clean break and prevent concentration of power. This meant that the men who had navigated the revolution's early challenges, who understood constitutional nuance and political compromise, were replaced by newcomers with no governing experience but plenty of ideological fervor. The new assembly was younger, more radical, and far less pragmatic than its predecessor. These new deputies divided into factions that would define revolutionary politics. On the right sat constitutional monarchists called feuillants, who wanted to preserve the 1791 settlement and strengthen royal authority. At the centre was a large group of unaffiliated deputies called the Plain or the Marsh, who would vote with whichever faction seemed most persuasive at any given moment. On the left sat the Girondins, named for the Gironde region that many represented, who favoured radical republican policies, aggressive revolutionary expansion, and war against the old monarchies of Europe. Further left still were the Montagnards or Mountain, so called because they sat in the Assembly's highest seats, who advocated direct democracy, economic controls, and close alliance with the Parisian popular movement. The dominant question facing this assembly was war. Austria and Prussia, where Louis XVI's royal relatives reigned, had issued the Declaration of Pillnitz in August 1791, threatening intervention to restore Louis's authority. This threat remained largely rhetorical. The German powers had no real desire to invade France, but it inflamed French opinion. The Girondins, particularly their effective orator Pierre Vergniaud and their intellectual leader Jacques-Pierre Brissot, became convinced that war was necessary and desirable. They argued that war would unmask traitors at home, rally the nation around the revolution, and export liberty to oppressed peoples across Europe, who would supposedly rise up to join France in a war of liberation against tyranny. This was spectacularly naive, but it was also politically convenient. War would strengthen the Girondins' position and weaken the king, who would be suspected of sympathizing with foreign monarchies. Even radical leaders who should have known better supported war. Only a few voices urged caution, most notably Maximilien Robespierre, a young lawyer from Arras who had emerged as the leading figure in the Jacobin Club. Robespierre argued that France should consolidate the revolution at home before attempting to export it abroad, and that the real enemies were internal reactionaries rather than foreign armies. But Robespierre's warnings were drowned out by war fever. King Louis XVI, cynically calculating that French military defeat would destroy the revolution and restore his power, encouraged the Assembly's war enthusiasm. On April 20th, 1792, with only 7 dissenting votes, the Legislative Assembly declared war on Austria. Prussia soon joined Austria, and France faced a coalition of Europe's most powerful military states. The French army, disorganized by the emigration of noble officers and the breakdown of discipline, was woefully unprepared. Initial French offensives were disasters. Soldiers mutinied, officers were suspected of treason, and the Prussian commander, the Duke of Brunswick, issued a manifesto threatening to destroy Paris if the royal family were harmed, a threat that only confirmed revolutionary suspicions of a conspiracy between the king and foreign powers. By July 1792, the military situation was desperate and political tension in Paris had reached a breaking point. The Assembly had declared the nation in danger, calling for volunteers to defend the revolution. Armed men from across France marched to Paris, including a battalion from Marseille, singing a stirring new war song that would become France's national anthem, La Marseillaise. These fédérés, as the volunteer fighters were called, were militant republicans who despised the king and demanded his removal. The radical journalists of Paris, especially Jean-Paul Marat, whose newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people, called incessantly for violence against aristocrats and traitors, whipped up popular fury. Marat demanded blood, insisting that thousands of enemies of the revolution must die to save liberty. His rhetoric was extreme even by revolutionary standards, but it resonated with Parisians who believed they were surrounded by conspirators. The popular sections, the neighborhood assemblies of Paris that had become centers of direct democracy, demanded the king's deposition and the creation of a republic. On August 10, 1792, the Paris sections launched an insurrection. Armed crowds and National Guard units controlled by radicals attacked the Tuileries Palace where the royal family resided. The king, at the last moment, fled to the Legislative Assembly seeking protection, leaving his Swiss guards to face the mob. The resulting massacre was horrific. The Swiss guards, under orders to defend the palace but then contradictory orders not to fire, were slaughtered. Nearly 1,000 people died that day, guards, attackers, and bystanders alike. The palace was sacked, and the monarchy was effectively overthrown. The Legislative Assembly, intimidated by armed crowds surrounding the building, and aware that it had lost any claim to control events, voted to suspend the king from his functions and imprison the royal family. They also called for elections to a new national convention that would be chosen by universal male suffrage, not just active citizens but all men, and would have the authority to write a new constitution for France. The revolution had entered a new, more radical phase. Constitutional monarchy was dead. France was about to become a republic, whether by democratic choice or revolutionary imposition. But before the convention could meet, Paris experienced one of the revolution's darkest episodes. In late August, news arrived that the fortress of Verdun had fallen to the Prussians, meaning the road to Paris lay open. Panic seized the capital. Marat and other radical journalists warned that aristocrats and priests imprisoned in Paris jails would break out once Prussian armies approached, massacre patriots, and open the city gates to foreign invaders. This paranoid fantasy found a receptive audience in a city terrified of imminent invasion and counter-revolution. Between September 2nd and September 6th, 1792, Parisian mobs broke into the prisons and conducted kangaroo courts, executing prisoners en masse. The September massacres claimed between 1,200 and 1,400 victims, not just aristocrats and non-juring priests who had refused to swear loyalty to the revolutionary church settlement, but also common criminals and even women and children. The killing was brutal and indiscriminate. Makeshift tribunals offered the pretense of justice, but nearly everyone brought before them was condemned. Bodies piled up in prison courtyards and were dumped in mass graves. The September massacres horrified moderate revolutionaries and shocked Europe. But the Paris Commune, the revolutionary municipal government, tacitly approved, and prominent revolutionary leaders either remained silent or openly justified the killings as necessary to defend the revolution. Georges Danton, the Minister of Justice, offered only weak protests. Robespierre later defended the massacres as an unfortunate but understandable expression of popular justice. The massacres revealed how far the revolution had traveled from its origins in Enlightenment principles. Popular sovereignty was becoming popular terror. Amid this bloodshed, elections proceeded for the National Convention. Voter turnout was low. Most French citizens were exhausted by constant crisis and alienated by the mounting violence. The men who gathered in Paris when the convention opened on September 20th, 1792, were thus not truly representative of French opinion, but rather of the most politically engaged Republicans. The convention's first act was to abolish the monarchy. On September 21st, it declared that royalty was abolished in France. The next day, September 22nd, 1792, was designated the first day of year one of the French Republic. France had become the first major European power to abolish monarchy entirely. The Republic was born at the exact moment that French military fortunes reversed dramatically. On September 20th, the same day the convention convened, French forces under General Charles-François Dumouriez defeated the Prussians at the Battle of Valmy. Though not a decisive military victory, the battle involved more artillery dueling than hand-to-hand combat. Valmy was a psychological turning point. The Prussians, expecting French collapse, instead faced an army willing to fight. The Duke of Brunswick ordered a retreat. Goethe, who witnessed the battle, reportedly told Prussian officers that day, "From this place and from this day forth begins a new era in world history." Emboldened by Valmy, French forces went on the offensive. Dumouriez invaded the Austrian Netherlands, modern Belgium, defeating Austrian armies at Jemappes in November. French forces also occupied the Rhineland, Savoy, and Nice. Revolutionary France, which had seemed on the brink of defeat in summer, controlled more territory by winter than the old monarchy ever had. The convention, intoxicated by military success and revolutionary zeal, issued a decree on November 19th offering fraternity and aid to all peoples who wished to recover their liberty. Revolutionary France was declaring itself the liberator of Europe, which Europe's monarchies interpreted as a declaration of universal war. Yet even as French armies marched abroad, the convention was riven by factional conflict. The Girondins, who dominated initially, faced mounting opposition from the Mountain, led by Robespierre, Danton, and the young firebrand Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just. The Girondins represented educated professionals from provincial cities who favored free market policies and feared the power of the Parisian mob. The Mountain allied with the Paris sections and the sans-culottes, the working people of Paris who wore trousers, rather than aristocratic knee breeches, and supported economic controls to manage shortages and inflation. The conflict between these factions crystallized around the fate of the former king. Louis XVI, now called Citizen Louis Capet, was imprisoned with his family in the Temple, a medieval fortress in Paris. In November, documents were discovered proving Louis had maintained secret correspondence with foreign courts and émigré aristocrats. The convention debated whether to try him for treason. The Girondins, fearing that executing the king would unite all Europe against France and radicalize the revolution beyond control, sought to avoid a trial, or at least to spare Louis's life. The Mountain insisted that Louis must die as an example and as a guarantee that the Republic could never be reversed. In December 1792, Louis XVI went on trial before the convention itself. The charges included conspiracy against liberty and attacks upon national sovereignty. The trial was a political show with a predetermined outcome. Louis was allowed counsel and defended himself with dignity, but the evidence of his communications with foreign powers was damning. In January 1793, the convention voted on 3 questions. Was Louis guilty? Yes, by near unanimity. Should the verdict be subject to popular referendum? No, defeated. What should his punishment be? This was the crucial vote. On January 16, 1793, the convention voted on Louis's sentence. Each deputy mounted the tribune to cast his vote publicly and justify it. The voting continued through the night. When dawn broke, the result was narrow but clear. 361 deputies voted for death, 288 for lesser sentences or delays, and 72 for death with conditions. A single vote majority, actually more like 27 votes when properly counted, had condemned the king. Among those who voted for execution was Louis-Philippe Joseph, Duke of Orléans, the king's own cousin, who had taken the revolutionary name Philippe Égalité, Philippe Equality. On January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in the Place de la Révolution, now Place de la Concorde. He attempted to speak to the crowd, but drums drowned out his words. The blade fell, and the executioner held up the severed head as the crowd roared approval. One spectator dipped his handkerchief in the royal blood as a souvenir. The king's body was buried in an unmarked grave. Louis XVI's execution shocked Europe and guaranteed that the war would become a fight to the death. Britain and the Dutch Republic joined the coalition against France. Spain declared war. Revolutionary France now faced virtually every major European power. Internally, the execution also deepened divisions. Moderate opinion was horrified. Peasants in devoutly Catholic regions like the Vendée rose in open revolt against the Republic, and the struggle between Girondins and Montagnards became increasingly vicious. The revolution was devouring the last restraints on violence. The worst was still to come. The year 1793 began with regicide and descended into hell. France faced military invasion from without and civil war within. The economy was collapsing under the strain of war, with the assignat currency losing value and food prices soaring. The convention struggled to govern a nation tearing itself apart. The moderates and radicals, who had united to overthrow the monarchy, now turned on each other with lethal fury. What emerged was not just political conflict, but something unprecedented: ideological terror wielded as state policy. The crisis intensified throughout the spring. In March, French forces in the Netherlands suffered a crushing defeat at Neerwinden, and General Dumouriez, the hero of Valmy, defected to the Austrians, confirming revolutionary paranoia about treason in high places. That same month, royalist uprisings erupted across western France, especially in the Vendée region. The Vendéan rebels were devout Catholic peasants enraged by religious persecution and military conscription. They proved surprisingly effective, defeating Republican forces and establishing a royal and Catholic army that controlled much of western France by summer. Faced with this emergency, the convention created emergency institutions. In March 1793, they established the Revolutionary Tribunal, a special court to try political crimes without normal judicial procedures. Trials were swift, appeals were impossible, and only two verdicts existed: acquittal or death. They also created the Committee of Public Safety, a 12-member executive body with sweeping powers to take any measures necessary to defend the revolution. Initially, the committee included both Girondins and Montagnards, but its composition would soon change dramatically. The struggle between Girondins and Montagnards had become personal and vicious. The Girondins denounced Marat as a bloodthirsty madman and attempted to impeach him. Marat was acquitted by the Revolutionary Tribunal and returned to the convention in triumph, carried on the shoulders of sans-culottes. Robespierre and Saint-Just attacked the Girondins as crypto-royalists who secretly opposed the revolution. Each side accused the other of treason, the most damning charge in revolutionary politics. The Paris sections and the Commune, allied with the Mountain, decided to resolve this conflict through force. On May 31st and June 2nd, 1793, armed crowds surrounded the convention and demanded the arrest of leading Girondin deputies. The convention, with cannons trained on the building and crowds threatening to massacre deputies, voted to expel and arrest 29 Girondins. This purge, achieved through mob intimidation, destroyed any pretense that the convention was a sovereign, deliberative body. Power now belonged to whoever could mobilize the Parisian crowd. The purge of the Girondins had two immediate consequences. First, it concentrated power in the hands of the Mountain, which now controlled the convention and soon dominated the Committee of Public Safety. Second, it provoked revolts in the provinces. In Bordeaux, Lyon, Marseille, and other cities with Girondin sympathies, local officials denounced the purge as a Parisian tyranny and raised troops against the convention. This federalist revolt, combined with the ongoing war in the Vendée and foreign invasion, meant that by summer 1793, the convention's authority barely extended beyond Paris. Amid this chaos, one event crystallized revolutionary psychology. On July 13, 1793, a young woman named Charlotte Corday gained entry to Jean-Paul Marat's apartment by claiming to have information about traitors in Normandy. Marat, suffering from a debilitating skin condition, received visitors while soaking in a medicinal bath. Corday approached and stabbed him in the chest with a kitchen knife, killing him almost instantly. She made no attempt to escape, believing her assassination of the man she considered a bloodthirsty tyrant would be hailed as tyrannicide. Instead, Marat became a martyr, The artist Jacques-Louis David painted The Death of Marat, depicting the revolutionary journalist as a secular saint murdered for his devotion to the people. Corday was guillotined 4 days after the murder, and Marat's funeral became a massive political spectacle. His assassination convinced radicals that the revolution faced a vast conspiracy of enemies who must be exterminated without mercy. The logic of terror, strike first or be destroyed, became the governing principle. In July 1793, Maximilien Robespierre joined the Committee of Public Safety, marking the beginning of what historians call the Reign of Terror. Robespierre was 35 years old, a provincial lawyer who had represented the Third Estate in 1789, and had become the revolution's most influential voice through his speeches at the Jacobin Club. He was known as the Incorruptible for his ascetic lifestyle and unwavering principles. He genuinely believed in the revolution's ideals, liberty, equality, popular sovereignty, but he also believed that these ideals could only be secured by destroying the revolution's enemies through systematic violence. Robespierre articulated the logic of terror in speeches that are both compelling and chilling. He argued that revolutionary government was not bound by normal legal protections because the revolution was a state of war between virtue and vice, between liberty and tyranny. In this war, moderation was weakness, compromise was treason, and mercy to enemies was cruelty to the innocent. Terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible, he declared in February 1794. The government of the revolution is liberty's despotism against tyranny. This was Orwellian before Orwell. Freedom through dictatorship, justice through mass execution. Under Robespierre's influence, the Committee of Public Safety transformed France into the world's first totalitarian state. They established the law of suspects in September 1793, which allowed authorities to arrest anyone who, by their conduct, their contacts, their words or their writings, showed themselves to be supporters of tyranny, of federalism, or to be enemies of liberty. This definition was so vague that virtually anyone could be arrested on suspicion alone. Denunciation became epidemic. Neighbors denounced neighbors, children denounced parents, servants denounced masters. The revolutionary tribunal's docket exploded. The committee also assumed control of military affairs and initiated the first modern mass mobilization. The Levée en masse decree of August 1793 declared that the young men shall go to battle. The married men shall forge arms and transport provisions. The women shall make tents and clothes and shall serve in the hospitals. The children shall turn old linen into lint. The old men shall repair to the public places to stimulate the courage of the warriors. This total war effort would eventually put over 1 million men under arms, creating armies larger than Europe had ever seen. Remarkably, it worked. By the end of 1793, French armies had reversed their defeats and stabilized the frontiers. The Federalist revolts were crushed with extreme brutality. Lyon was besieged and partially demolished, with mass executions of rebels. The Vendéan uprising was suppressed through scorched earth tactics that amounted to genocide. Republican columns swept through the Vendée, burning villages, killing civilians, and attempting what they explicitly called extermination of the rebel population. Historians estimate that between 150,000 and 250,000 people died in the Vendée, men, women, and children, in what some scholars consider the French Revolution's greatest crime. In Paris, the guillotine became the revolution's central symbol. Positioned in the Place de la Révolution, it operated almost daily, executing aristocrats, priests, Girondins, ordinary criminals, and increasingly anyone who expressed doubt about the Committee of Public Safety's policies. The guillotine was considered a humanitarian improvement over previous execution methods. Quick, egalitarian, and supposedly painless. Dr. Joseph Guillotin, for whom the device was named, though he didn't invent it, had proposed it as a more humane form of capital punishment. The revolution made it an industrial instrument of political terror. Initially, most victims were genuinely counter-revolutionary, nobles who plotted with émigrés, priests who incited rebellion, generals suspected of treason. But the Terror's logic was expansive. In October 1793, Marie Antoinette was tried on absurd charges, including incest with her son, convicted and guillotined. In the same month, 21 Girondin leaders went to the scaffold, singing the Marseillaise as they mounted the scaffold. Philippe Égalité, despite his revolutionary credentials and vote for his cousin's death, was executed in November. The Terror devoured not just counter-revolutionaries, but rival revolutionaries. Two factions emerged within the mountain itself. The Hébertists, followers of the radical journalist Jacques Hébert, wanted to accelerate the Terror, implement price controls more strictly, and complete the de-Christianization of France through aggressive atheistic campaigns. The Indulgents, led by Georges Danton and Camille Desmoulins, argued that the emergency had passed and the Terror should be relaxed. Both factions were challenging the Committee of Public Safety's authority, and Robespierre would tolerate neither. In March 1794, Robespierre moved against the Hébertists. Hébert and 18 followers were arrested, tried for conspiracy, and executed. 2 weeks later, Robespierre turned on the Indulgents with even greater fury. Danton, who had been instrumental in creating the Committee of Public Safety, was arrested along with Desmoulins and other allies. The charges were corruption and undermining the revolution by calling for mercy toward traitors. Danton's trial was a travesty. He was a brilliant orator who might have swayed public opinion. So the convention passed a decree allowing the tribunal to end debates and proceed directly to judgment. Danton and his co-defendants were convicted and executed on April 5, 1794. Danton's execution marked a turning point. He had been one of the revolution's most popular leaders, a man who had rallied France against invasion in 1792. If Danton could be guillotined, no one was safe. As Danton himself allegedly said while being led to execution, "Show my head to the people. It is worth seeing." Another version of his last words was addressed to the executioner. "Don't forget to show my head to the people. It's well worth seeing." After eliminating both factions, Robespierre dominated the Committee of Public Safety, along with his close allies Saint-Just and Georges Couthon. They pushed through the Law of 22 Prairial in June 1794, which accelerated terror to its most extreme phase. The law eliminated most remaining procedural protections for defendants. No defense witnesses, no defense lawyers, only two possible verdicts, acquittal or death. The Revolutionary Tribunal became a conveyor belt to the guillotine. In June and July 1794, nearly 1,400 people were executed in Paris alone, more than in the previous 14 months combined. This period is called the Great Terror. The Terror extended beyond Paris. Representatives on mission, sent by the committee to the provinces with unlimited authority, conducted mass executions. In Nantes, the representative Jean-Baptiste Carrier devised particularly horrific methods, including mass drownings in the Loire River, called Republican baptisms or vertical deportations. In Toulon, Paul Barras oversaw mass executions of inhabitants who had surrendered the naval base to the British. The committee itself debated moving beyond individual executions to mass deportations. There was even discussion of using poison gas, though these plans were never implemented. Robespierre also promoted the cult of the supreme being, an attempt to replace Catholicism with a deistic civic religion. On June 8, 1794, Paris celebrated the Festival of the Supreme Being with elaborate ceremonies designed by the artist David. Robespierre presided over the festival as the revolution's high priest, giving speeches about virtue and the immortality of the soul. The spectacle was impressive but also alienating. Many revolutionaries who were committed atheists saw the cult as ridiculous mysticism. Many ordinary French people saw it as poor substitute for their Catholic faith. Robespierre's combination of religious innovation and political terror was isolating him. By summer 1794, France's military situation had dramatically improved. French armies were victorious on multiple fronts. The invasion threat had passed. The domestic rebellions were crushed. The emergency that had justified emergency measures no longer existed. Yet the terror was intensifying rather than relaxing. More people were dying under the guillotine even as the revolution's external enemies retreated. This paradox troubled even committed revolutionaries. Why was terror increasing when danger was decreasing? The answer lay in the logic Robespierre had articulated. The goal was not merely to defend the revolution, but to create a republic of virtue, a society where self-interest was abolished and citizens were motivated purely by public spirit. This utopian goal required not just defeating counter-revolutionaries, but transforming human nature itself, an impossible task that justified endless purging of those deemed insufficiently virtuous. The terror had become not a means to an end, but an end in itself, self-perpetuating and self-justifying. But the terror's architects had made a fatal miscalculation. By eliminating all factional opposition, by destroying both left and right, they had isolated themselves. Robespierre, Saint-Just, and Couthon had concentrated so much power that other members of the Committee of Public Safety and the Convention began to fear they would be next. A pragmatic conspiracy formed among men who had nothing in common except terror of Robespierre and desire to survive. Joseph Fouché, Tallien, Marat, and others, many themselves deeply complicit in the terror, began plotting against the man they privately called the tyrant. Robespierre sensed the conspiracy, but mishandled his response. On July 26, 1794, 8th Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, he gave a long, rambling speech to the convention, warning of conspirators, but refusing to name them, meaning everyone felt threatened. The next day, July 27th, 9th Thermidor, when Robespierre and Saint-Just attempted to address the convention, they were shouted down. Deputies who had been silent for months suddenly found courage to denounce them. A decree of arrest was passed. That evening, the Paris Commune attempted to rally support for Robespierre, but the insurrection failed to materialize. Robespierre was found in the Hôtel de Ville with a bullet wound to the jaw. Whether self-inflicted or fired by a gendarme remains unclear. He spent the night in agony, unable to speak, bleeding onto papers inscribed with revolutionary slogans. On July 28th, 10 Thermidor, Robespierre, Saint-Just, Couthon, and 19 others were executed without trial. The crowd that had once cheered Robespierre's speeches now celebrated his death. The Thermidorian reaction, as the anti-Robespierre coup came to be known, ended the reign of terror. The law of 22 Prairial was repealed, the Revolutionary Tribunal was reformed, and political prisoners were released. Over the following months, the Jacobin Club was closed, and many of those who had implemented the terror were themselves tried and executed. The guillotine did not stop. It merely claimed different victims. The death toll of the reign of terror remains disputed, but reasonable estimates suggest that at least 40,000 people were executed officially, with perhaps 200,000 more dying in the suppression of internal revolts, particularly in the Vendée. These figures, shocking in themselves, do not capture the terror's psychological impact, the denunciations, arrests, imprisonments, and fear that permeated daily life. An entire society had been traumatized by the revolution's most radical phase. The fundamental question the terror raised: can violence be justified in pursuit of virtue? Can dictatorship serve liberty? Can terror establish justice? Would haunt political thought for centuries. The revolutionaries of 1793-94 genuinely believed they were creating a better world, yet they built a nightmare. Their experiment demonstrated that ideological purity, when combined with state power and unchecked by institutional restraints, produces not utopia, but mass death. It was a lesson that future revolutionaries, from Lenin to Mao, would fail to learn. The men who overthrew Robespierre on 9th Thermidor faced a problem that would plague France for the next 5 years. Having dismantled dictatorship, how could they create stable government without either restoring the terror or allowing royalist counter-revolution? The Thermidorians, as they became known, were themselves deeply compromised. Most had voted for the terror's policies. Many had served as representatives on mission conducting mass executions in the provinces. They had destroyed Robespierre not from principle, but from fear for their own lives. These were not men of vision, but survivors trying to navigate between extremes. The immediate aftermath of Thermidor brought relief. Political prisoners were released from overcrowded jails, their families weeping with joy at seeing loved ones they had thought doomed. The law of 22 Prairial was repealed, restoring some legal protections to the accused. The Committee of Public Safety was stripped of dictatorial powers, and its membership rotated to prevent any individual from dominating. The Revolutionary Tribunal continued, but under reformed procedures that made convictions more difficult. The guillotine's daily harvest declined dramatically, but dismantling the terror created new problems. As repression relaxed, political violence didn't disappear, it simply changed direction. In Paris, and especially in southern France, gangs of young men called the Muscadins, or the Jeunesse Dorée, gilded youth, often relatives of terror victims, attacked former Jacobins in the streets. In Lyon, Marseille, and other cities, the White Terror saw royalist mobs murdering Republicans who had implemented revolutionary policies. Former terrorists were dragged from their homes and beaten or killed. The authorities, now sympathetic to anti-Jacobin violence, rarely intervened. The convention also faced economic catastrophe. Years of war, the collapse of overseas trade, and the massive printing of assignat currency had produced hyperinflation. The assignat, which had been worth its face value in 1790, had lost 90% of its value by 1795. Bread prices soared. Parisians faced genuine starvation during the harsh winter of 1794–95. The government attempted price controls, but these merely drove goods into black markets. France's economy was in ruins, and the revolutionary government that had promised prosperity through equality had delivered widespread poverty. These economic hardships sparked popular uprisings in Paris in the spring of 1795. On 1 Prairial, May 20th, crowds invaded the convention demanding bread and the Constitution of 1793, the democratic constitution written by the Mountain, but never implemented. The deputies were besieged for hours. One deputy, Jean-Bertrand Ferraud, was murdered by the crowd, his head cut off and presented to the convention president on a pike. But unlike during the Terror, the authorities crushed the insurrection. General Pichegru's troops surrounded the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the working-class neighborhood that had been the revolution's shock troops, and forced its surrender. The sans-culottes, who had been the revolution's driving force since 1789, were decisively defeated. The Parisian popular movement would not again play a central role in French politics. With the threat from the left neutralized, the Thermidorians focused on creating a new constitutional order. They drafted the Constitution of Year 3, 1795, designed explicitly to prevent both populist dictatorship and royalist restoration. The Constitution established a bicameral legislature, a council of 500 to propose laws, and a council of ancients, 250 members, to approve or reject them, elected by property-qualified voters. Executive power was vested in a 5-member directory that gave the regime its name. The system had elaborate checks and balances specifically designed to prevent any individual or faction from concentrating power. The Constitution of Year 3 reflected the Thermidorians' fundamental conservatism. They wanted order, stability, and protection of property. They feared democracy, believing that universal suffrage had empowered the Terror. They also feared royalism, knowing that most French people, if given free choice, might restore the monarchy. The regime they created was thus a republic designed to resist the will of the majority, a contradiction that would prove fatal. Before the new constitution took effect, the convention made a self-interested decision that undermined its legitimacy. Fearing that new elections would produce a royalist majority, they decreed that 2/3 of the new councils must be chosen from existing convention members. This 2/3 decree provoked outrage. Royalists in Paris organized an insurrection on 13 Vendémiaire, October 5, 1795, to prevent the convention from completing this maneuver. Sections of the National Guard and armed civilians marched on the convention. The convention was saved by a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte. Paul Barras, overseeing Paris's defense, gave Napoleon command of the troops guarding the convention. Napoleon acted decisively, positioning artillery to command the streets and firing grapeshot into the advancing royalist columns. The whiff of grapeshot, as Napoleon later described it, dispersed the insurrection, killing several hundred rebels. This episode demonstrated two things. Military force was now the ultimate arbiter of political disputes, and Napoleon Bonaparte was a name to remember. The Directory that took power in November 1795 governed France for 4 years, a period often dismissed as corrupt and ineffective, but actually marking important developments. The 5 directors, Barras, Carnot, La Réveillère-Lepeau, Le Tourneur, and Rubel, were competent administrators, but lacked charisma or popular support. They governed a country exhausted by revolution, suspicious of ideology, and desperate for stability and prosperity. The Directory never achieved legitimacy, but it did provide breathing space after years of crisis. The Directory's primary achievement was military success abroad. French armies, reformed and motivated by revolutionary nationalism, won stunning victories across Europe. In Italy, General Napoleon Bonaparte conducted a campaign that became legendary, defeating larger Austrian and Piedmontese forces through speed, strategic brilliance, and inspired leadership. In 1796-97, Napoleon transformed the Italian peninsula, creating sister republics modeled on France, and stripping Italian states of artworks that were shipped to Paris. He also negotiated the Treaty of Campo Formio with Austria, making peace on terms favorable to France. Napoleon returned to Paris as the Republic's greatest hero, a military genius who had achieved what years of revolutionary warfare had not. Decisive victory over France's enemies. General Hoche pacified the Vendée through a combination of military pressure and political concessions. General Marat won victories in Germany. By 1797, only Britain remained at war with France, and even Britain was war-weary. France, which had been on the brink of defeat in 1793, now dominated the continent. The revolution's mass mobilization and nationalist energy had created military power on a scale Europe had never seen. But the Directory's domestic record was far less impressive. The regime lurched from crisis to crisis, unable to establish stable finances or effective administration. Inflation continued despite attempts at currency reform. The government eventually repudiated 2/3 of the national debt, effectively declaring bankruptcy and destroying the savings of thousands of bondholders. Corruption was endemic. Directors and their associates enriched themselves through war contracts and graft. Barras in particular became notorious for his venality, maintaining luxurious lifestyle while ordinary Parisians struggled. The regime also faced constant threats from left and right. Jacobins remained active, hoping to restore the Republic of Virtue. Royalists plotted to restore the Bourbon monarchy. Each annual election threatened to overturn the fragile political balance. In the spring 1797 elections, Royalists won major victories, gaining control of the councils. Had this result stood, France would likely have restored constitutional monarchy, but the Directory refused to accept defeat. On 18th Fructidor, September 4, 1797, 3 directors, Barras, Rubel, and La Réveillère-Lepeau, supported by General Augereau and troops loyal to Napoleon, staged a coup. They annulled elections in 49 departments, arrested royalist leaders, including 2 fellow directors, and deported dozens of deputies to the hellish prison colony of French Guiana. The Fructidor coup revealed the Directory's fundamental illegitimacy. It maintained power through military force rather than popular consent. The coup established a pattern. In 1798, Floréal, the Directory annulled elections that favored Jacobins. In 1799, Prairial, the councils forced the resignation of directors they disapproved. The Constitution's elaborate mechanisms were repeatedly violated. Elections became meaningless because the government simply voided results it disliked. The Directory was trapped in a vicious cycle. It could not allow free elections because free elections would destroy it, but by preventing free elections, it destroyed its own legitimacy. The regime also faced foreign policy disasters. Intoxicated by military success, the Directory pursued increasingly aggressive policies. In 1798, they approved Napoleon's fantastical scheme to invade Egypt, ostensibly to threaten British trade routes to India, but really to satisfy Napoleon's Alexander the Great ambitions. The Egyptian campaign began with dramatic success. Napoleon defeated the Mamluk forces at the Battle of the Pyramids, but the British Navy under Admiral Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, stranding Napoleon's army in the Middle East. Meanwhile, the Directory's aggressive policies in Europe provoked the formation of the Second Coalition against France. Britain, Russia, Austria, the Ottoman Empire, and several smaller powers united to contain French expansion. In 1799, French armies suffered defeats in Italy and Germany, losing most of the territory Napoleon had conquered. The Directory's inability to cope with this renewed military threat severely damaged its credibility. By 1799, France was experiencing crisis déjà vu, military threat, political instability, economic distress, and weak government. Many French people longed for a strong leader who could restore order and glory. Royalists hoped for a Bourbon restoration. Jacobins dreamed of reviving the radical republic. But increasingly, ambitious politicians and generals contemplated something different, a military coup that would sweep away the Directory's ineffective institutions and create authoritative government. Several figures were positioning themselves for such a coup. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, the abbé who had helped launch the revolution in 1789 and who was now a director, believed that France needed a new constitution creating stronger executive power, with himself as chief executive. He was searching for a general to provide military muscle for a coup. Several generals were candidates, but one stood out: Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon had returned from Egypt in October 1799, abandoning his army, which would eventually be defeated and repatriated, to salvage his political position. His Egyptian campaign had been strategically absurd and ended in failure, but he successfully spun it as a glorious adventure, bringing back exotic artifacts and tales of Oriental splendor. More importantly, he was France's most famous general, celebrated for his Italian victories. He was politically astute, personally charismatic, and hungry for power. Sieyès approached Napoleon about collaborating on a coup. Napoleon agreed, while privately planning to dominate any new regime himself. The coup was planned for 18 to 19 Brumaire, November 9th to 10th, 1799. The conspirators included Sieyès, Napoleon, Talleyrand, the former bishop and cunning diplomat, Fouché, the former terrorist now serving as police minister, and Napoleon's brother, Lucien Bonaparte, who was president of the Council of 500. They fabricated a Jacobin conspiracy threat to justify extraordinary measures. On 18 Brumaire, the councils were persuaded to move their meetings to Saint-Cloud Palace outside Paris for security reasons, with Napoleon given command of the Paris garrison. On 19th Brumaire, Napoleon entered the Council of Ancients to present his case, but was met with suspicion. He then went to the 500, where he was greeted with shouts of "Outlaw!" and "Down with the dictator!" Deputies physically attacked him, and he had to be rescued by grenadiers. Lucien Bonaparte saved the coup by lying to the troops outside, claiming that assassins were threatening the councils. He dramatically pointed a sword at his brother's chest and swore to kill Napoleon himself if he ever threatened the Republic. This theatrical gesture convinced the soldiers that the deputies were the problem, not Napoleon. Troops under General Marat cleared the council hall, dispersing deputies who fled through windows in their togas. That evening, a rump session of compliant deputies voted to abolish the Directory and create a provisional government headed by 3 consuls: Napoleon, Sieyès, and Roger Ducos. The coup of 18. Brumaire ended the Directory and, effectively, the French Revolution. Within weeks, a new constitution, drafted largely by Napoleon, established the consulate with Napoleon as first consul, holding overwhelming executive power. Sieyès received honors and a retirement pension but was politically sidelined. The promise of revolutionary government by the people was replaced by authoritarian rule by a military strongman. Barely a decade after the fall of the Bastille, France had traded absolutist monarchy for military dictatorship. Napoleon Bonaparte was 30 years old when he seized power in November 1799. Yet he had already lived several lifetimes of ambition and achievement. Born on the island of Corsica, which had only recently become French territory, to minor nobility of Italian descent, Napoleon was an outsider who climbed to the pinnacle of French power through exceptional talent, ruthless ambition, and the opportunities created by revolution. Understanding Napoleon's rise requires understanding both the man and the revolutionary context that made his ascent possible. Napoleon's early life provided little hint of future greatness. He grew up speaking Italian, learned French with a heavy Corsican accent he never lost, and attended French military schools on scholarship. He was small in stature, actually average height for the era, but the myth of the little corporal would persist. Physically unremarkable and socially awkward, but he possessed a ferocious intellect, photographic memory, and consuming ambition. He was obsessed with military history, particularly ancient Rome and Alexander the Great. He studied artillery science and tactics with monkish dedication. He was convinced that he was destined for greatness. The revolution created opportunities for such ambitious outsiders. In the old regime, Napoleon's minor noble birth and provincial origins would have limited him to junior officer ranks. But the revolution destroyed aristocratic privilege and promoted based on merit, or at least on political reliability and success. When noble officers emigrated or were purged, rapid advancement became possible. Napoleon, who initially supported the revolution because it opposed aristocratic privilege, rose quickly through the ranks. His breakthrough came in 1793 at the Siege of Toulon. The Mediterranean naval base had been surrendered to the British by royalist rebels, and Republican forces were attempting to recapture it. Napoleon, then an obscure artillery captain, devised the plan that forced Toulon's surrender. His reward was promotion to brigadier general at age 24, but he nearly lost everything during the Thermidorian reaction due to his association with Robespierre's brother. Only his Toulon reputation and the patronage of Paul Barras saved him. His next opportunity came in October 1795, when Barras appointed him to defend the convention against the Vendémiaire insurrection. Napoleon's decisive use of artillery broke the royalist uprising and secured the Directory's establishment. This success won him command of the Army of Italy, which was supposed to be a secondary front, while the main French effort focused on Germany. The Italian campaign of 1796–97 transformed Napoleon from a successful general into a legendary figure. He inherited an army that was demoralized, undersupplied, and outnumbered by Austrian and Piedmontese forces. Through a series of rapid maneuvers and bold attacks, Napoleon defeated enemy armies that were individually larger than his own. He won battles at Montenotte, Lodi, Arcole, and Rivoli, each victory enhancing his reputation. He told his soldiers they were fighting for glory and plunder, and he delivered both. His troops adored him because he shared their hardships, remembered their names, and rewarded their courage. But Napoleon was more than a battlefield tactician. He was also a political operator who understood that military success could be leveraged into political power. He negotiated treaties with defeated Italian states, created satellite republics, and sent wagons of Italian art treasures back to Paris, both enriching France and building his own reputation as a conqueror. He cultivated a personal legend, writing proclamations comparing himself to Hannibal, crossing the Alps. He understood propaganda and public relations in ways his contemporaries did not. Napoleon also developed his authoritarian governing style in Italy. He imposed French-style constitutions on Italian republics, but ensured real power remained with him or his subordinates. He crushed resistance brutally. When the city of Pavia rebelled, he allowed his troops to sack it. He raised enormous financial contributions from conquered territories. He showed the combination of reformist principles and iron-fisted control that would characterize his later rule of France. The Treaty of Campo Formio which Napoleon negotiated directly with Austria in October 1797, exceeded his authority, but brought the War of the First Coalition to a successful conclusion. The Directory could hardly object to a general who had won France's greatest military victories in living memory. Napoleon returned to Paris in December 1797 as the Republic's savior, celebrated with triumphal ceremonies. He was young, successful, charismatic, and dangerous, a man clearly destined for power. The Directory, recognizing Napoleon as a potential threat, supported his Egyptian expedition partly to get him away from Paris. Napoleon himself saw Egypt as a stepping stone to greater glory. He sailed with an army in May 1798, captured Malta along the way, and landed in Egypt in July. He defeated the Mamluk forces at the Battle of the Pyramids and entered Cairo in triumph. But Nelson's destruction of the French fleet at Aboukir Bay trapped Napoleon in Egypt, turning his glorious expedition into a strategic disaster. Napoleon made the best of the situation, establishing French administration in Egypt and launching an unsuccessful invasion of Syria. But by mid-1799, with news reaching Egypt of French defeats in Europe and political crisis in Paris, Napoleon calculated that his opportunity had arrived. In August 1799, he secretly abandoned his army and sailed for France with a handful of subordinates. This was technically desertion, but Napoleon gambled correctly that his reputation would protect him. He arrived in Paris in October 1799 to find the political situation even more unstable than he had hoped. The Directory was discredited, the councils were paralyzed by factional conflict, and the new military crisis had created an atmosphere of emergency. Most importantly, there was no obvious alternative leader. The revolutionary generation was exhausted or dead. Sieyès was intelligent but had no popular support. Other generals lacked Napoleon's combination of military glory and political skill. The situation seemed made for Napoleon, or perhaps Napoleon was made for the situation. The coup of 1819 Brumaire was both farcical and significant. The actual execution was almost bungled. Napoleon showed his limitations as a parliamentary orator and nearly lost control. But the underlying power dynamics were clear. French politics had become a competition among military strongmen, and Napoleon was the strongest. The fact that the coup required military force to override elected representatives demonstrated how far France had traveled from revolutionary ideals of popular sovereignty. The Constitution of Year VIII, promulgated in December 1799, reflected Napoleon's political philosophy. It maintained republican forms, there was still no king, but concentrated real power in Napoleon's hands as first consul. Two other consuls existed, but had only advisory roles. An elaborate system of assemblies and councils created the appearance of representative government, but these bodies could not initiate legislation and had limited power to reject proposals from the first consul. Elections occurred, but through a convoluted system of notability lists that ensured only reliable candidates reached positions of power. Napoleon justified this authoritarian republic through a plebiscite, a technique he would use repeatedly. The constitution was submitted to voters with a simple yes or no choice. The results, announced in February 1800, showed overwhelming approval. 3,011,007 votes for, 1,562 against. These figures were fraudulent, with massive vote inflation by officials, but the plebiscite achieved its purpose, providing democratic legitimacy for authoritarian rule. As first consul, Napoleon moved quickly to consolidate power and address France's pressing problems. He centralized administration, appointing prefects to govern departments and replacing elected local officials with appointed ones. He created the Bank of France to stabilize finances. He opened negotiations with the Catholic Church to end the religious division that had plagued France since 1790. He offered amnesty to émigrés who would return and accept the revolution's property settlement. He purged the bureaucracy of incompetents and extremists, replacing them with talented administrators regardless of political background. Most importantly, Napoleon addressed the military situation. The Second Coalition was still threatening France. In the spring of 1800, Napoleon personally led an army across the Alps, deliberately echoing Hannibal and his own Italian campaign, to strike at Austrian forces in Italy. On June 14, 1800, at Marengo, Napoleon came close to defeat but turned near disaster into victory through determination and timely reinforcements. Marengo secured French control of northern Italy and enhanced Napoleon's reputation for military genius and good fortune. By the end of 1800, Napoleon had transformed France's situation. General Marat defeated the Austrians at Hohenlinden in Germany. Austria signed the Treaty of Luneville in February 1801, acknowledging French dominance in Western Europe. Napoleon negotiated the Concordat with Pope Pius VII in 1801, restoring Catholic worship while keeping the Church under state control. In March 1802, Britain signed the Treaty of Amiens, bringing temporary peace to all of Europe. Napoleon had achieved what the Directory never could: military victory, international peace, domestic stability, and effective government. France in 1802 was transformed from the chaos of 1799. Order replaced anarchy. The economy stabilized. Roads were repaired, canals built, harbors improved. The Bank of France backed a stable currency. The Napoleonic Code, still being drafted, would rationalize French law. Education was reformed through new secondary schools called lycées. The administration functioned efficiently. Talented men of bourgeois background could rise in government and military service based on merit. These were real accomplishments that brought practical benefits to millions of French people. But these achievements came at a cost measured in liberty. Press freedom was eliminated. Napoleon reduced Paris newspapers from 73 to 13, then to 4, all subject to censorship. Political opposition was suppressed. The secret police under Fouché monitored potential threats. Elections became empty rituals. The revolutionary promises of liberty and popular sovereignty were abandoned in favor of order and efficiency imposed from above. Napoleon's trajectory from 1799 to 1802 revealed the revolution's ultimate paradox. It had begun by overthrowing absolute monarchy in the name of liberty and ended by creating military dictatorship justified by effectiveness. The revolution had not failed exactly. Feudalism was dead, legal equality was established, careers were open to talent, but it had transformed into something very different from what the revolutionaries of 1789 had envisioned. The question was whether this was revolution's betrayal or its inevitable conclusion. The French Revolution began with the fall of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, and effectively ended with Napoleon's coup on November 9, 1799. Just over 10 years that transformed not only France, but the entire trajectory of modern history. What did this decade of revolution, terror, and war ultimately achieve? What changed forever? And what lessons echo across the centuries? The most obvious achievement was the destruction of the old regime. Absolute monarchy in France was dead, never to be fully restored. Despite the Bourbon Restoration after Napoleon's fall, French kings would never again rule with the arbitrary power of Louis XIV or Louis XV. Feudalism was abolished. Peasants no longer owed dues to lords. Nobles no longer held special legal status, and careers were legally open to talent rather than restricted by birth. These changes, enshrined in the Napoleonic Code, would spread across Europe as French armies carried revolutionary principles to conquered territories. Even when Napoleon was defeated, these reforms largely persisted because they reflected modern economic and social realities. The revolution also established new political languages and categories that structure our world today. The terms left and right in politics originated from the seating arrangements in the revolutionary assemblies. The concepts of popular sovereignty, constitutional government, and human rights, though existing before 1789, were given dramatic, unforgettable expression in revolutionary events. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen became a founding document for modern liberal democracy, inspiring independence movements and constitutions worldwide. The revolution demonstrated, for better and worse, that ordinary people could overthrow established governments and reshape their societies through collective action. Nationalism emerged as a transformative force. Before the revolution, people thought of themselves as subjects of a king or inhabitants of a province. The revolution created French citizens who belonged to the French nation, a community defined by shared political values and collective sovereignty rather than dynastic loyalty. This revolutionary nationalism, which motivated French armies to fight with unprecedented determination, would spread across Europe and eventually the world, reshaping international relations and fueling both liberation movements and devastating conflicts for the next 2 centuries. The revolution also pioneered modern ideological politics. Before 1789, politics was primarily about who held power within an accepted framework. The revolution made politics about what kind of society should exist, what principles should govern, what values should prevail, how society should be organized. Jacobins, Girondins, and constitutional monarchists weren't merely competing for offices, but advocating fundamentally different visions of human social organization. This ideological intensity made revolutionary politics both exhilarating and deadly, and it established patterns that would recur in the Russian, Chinese, and other modern revolutions. Perhaps most significantly, the revolution demonstrated both the possibilities and the dangers of attempting rapid, radical social transformation. The revolutionaries genuinely believed they could create a society based on reason, virtue, and equality, essentially engineering a new humanity. Their failure, particularly the terror's descent into mass killing in the name of virtue, raised fundamental questions about human nature and political action. Can violence create justice? Can dictatorship serve liberty? Can you force people to be free? The revolution suggested that the answer to these questions is no, yet subsequent revolutionaries repeatedly attempted similar projects with similar results. The revolution also revealed the power of ideas to shape history. Enlightenment philosophy, the social contract, natural rights, popular sovereignty, transformed from intellectual concepts debated in salons to principles that millions were willing to kill and die for. Ideas about equality, liberty, and citizenship, once expressed, could not be contained. This was both inspiring and terrifying, showing that intellectual and social changes could destabilize societies and unleash forces beyond anyone's control. Napoleon's dictatorship represented both revolution's culmination and its contradiction. He preserved the revolution's core achievements: legal equality, careers open to talent, rationalized administration, religious toleration, while destroying its political ideals of liberty and popular sovereignty. This Napoleonic synthesis, authoritarian, modernity, would inspire imitators from Latin America to Asia. It demonstrated that revolutionary, social and economic reforms could coexist with political authoritarianism, a lesson that 20th century authoritarian modernizers would take to heart. The revolution's human cost was staggering. At least 400,000 French people died during the revolutionary decade, 40,000 in the Terror, 200,000 to 250,000 in the Vendée, and 150,000 in the war. Millions more across Europe would die in the Napoleonic Wars that followed. Countless lives were shattered by emigration, imprisonment, confiscation, or the deaths of family members. These costs must be weighed against the revolution's achievements in any honest accounting. Yet despite its violence and ultimate political failure, the French Revolution fundamentally reshaped human possibilities. It proved that established political and social orders were not eternal or natural, but human constructions that could be dismantled and rebuilt. It demonstrated that ordinary people could be agents of historical change rather than merely subjects of forces beyond their control. It established principles, human rights, popular sovereignty, legal equality, that continue to inspire liberation movements today. It created modern politics, modern nationalism, and modern revolution itself. The French Revolution's slogan, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, promised a transformed world. The reality was far messier, more violent, and more ambiguous than the revolutionaries of 1789 could have imagined, but the promise endured. Every subsequent movement for human liberty, from Haiti's slave revolt to the Arab Spring, echoes the French Revolution. Every debate about rights, equality, and justice draws on its language. Every revolution, from Russia to China to Cuba, follows patterns it established and struggles with problems it revealed. 10 years from Bastille to Bonaparte changed the world forever. The revolution's legacy is not simple triumph or simple tragedy, but something more complex. The demonstration that human societies can be fundamentally transformed, that established orders are not permanent, that ideas have world-shaking power, and that the pursuit of perfect justice through revolutionary violence leads not to utopia, but to suffering that haunts us still. The French Revolution was the beginning of modern politics, modern democracy, modern nationalism, and modern revolution. We still live in the world it created, still debate the questions it raised, still struggle with the tensions between liberty and equality, order and freedom, reform and revolution that it brought to dramatic life on history's stage.